The palace of Valeris never truly slept. Even in its quiet hours, energy flowed through the translucent walls like slow-moving light beneath frozen water, carrying data, heat, and the faint hum of a civilization that believed itself too advanced for mistakes. Colin had learned over the years that this belief was the most dangerous thing about the place. He stood near the inner balcony, watching courier drones drift between spires, their movements precise to the point of obsession. The air smelled faintly metallic, a side effect of the planetary shield cycling overhead. Somewhere deep below, gravity regulators adjusted by a fraction of a unit, and a court official nearly dropped his datapad as a result. Colin smiled to himself. Even the palace liked reminding people who was really in charge. He adjusted the collar of his advisory uniform, still not fully accustomed to the way Valerian fabric resisted wrinkles, as if offended by the concept. Humans, he'd once joked, were a species held together by wrinkles and bad decisions. The joke had not gone over well with the tailoring council, but Princess Senna had laughed so hard she'd nearly fallen off her chair. Senna was late today, which was unusual. At 8 cycles old, she treated schedules with a seriousness that alarmed most adults and amused Colin endlessly. He suspected it came from growing up surrounded by people who treated time like a weapon. When she was late, it usually meant she was being delayed by something important, like an emergency council session or an advisor explaining why children should not ask why taxes existed. Colin leaned against the railing and waited. He had learned patience here, mostly because impatience was indistinguishable from treason if expressed incorrectly. Behind him, the doors slid open with a whisper of compressed air. Small footsteps followed, light but deliberate. "You're 3 minutes late," Colin said without turning. "I know," Senna replied, her voice calm, slightly breathless. "I was detained." "That sounds serious." It was extremely serious. They were discussing the seating arrangement for the diplomatic summit. Colin turned then, lowering himself into a crouch so they were eye level. Senna's long ears angled backward in irritation, a clear sign she had been listening politely while mentally planning several strategic resignations for the adults involved. Her eyes were sharp, observant, far older than they should have been. "Let me guess," Colin said. "Someone wanted the ambassador from Keltar closer to the refreshment table." "Yes, and someone else argued this would destabilize the region." Colin nodded gravely. "That checks out. Pastry proximity is a known catalyst for war." She smiled despite herself, ears relaxing. That smile, he thought, was rarer than antimatter in this palace. They moved toward the tutoring chamber, a modest space by palace standards, which meant it was only the size of a small human auditorium. The walls displayed slow-moving star charts, constellations shifting as real-time data updated. Senna climbed onto her chair and immediately activated the central console, pulling up a map of disputed border systems. "Today," she said, "I want to know why councils pretend certainty when they don't have enough information." Colin blinked. "Starting light, I see." "They do it all the time," she continued. "Yesterday, an advisor told my mother that increasing patrols would guarantee peace." "And did anyone ask how?" "No," they nodded, very respectfully. Colin leaned back, folding his arms. "Well, certainty is comforting. It makes people feel tall, especially people who are, intellectually speaking, sitting down." Senna tilted her head. "So they lie?" "Not exactly. Lying requires effort. This is more professional guessing." She considered that. "Is that why wars happen?" "Usually, yes. That and bad maps." They spent the next hour dissecting historical conflicts, Senna asking pointed questions, Colin answering honestly, occasionally deflecting her darker realizations with humor. When she proposed that most advisors optimize for personal survival rather than societal good, Colin pretended to be shocked. "I am wounded by this accusation," he said. "Some of them also optimize for snacks." A soft chime interrupted them. Court summons. Colin sighed. "That'll be me." "Are you in trouble?" Senna asked too casually. "Always, but rarely for the correct reasons." He stood, smoothing his uniform. "Remember what we discussed. Question certainty, especially when it's loud." She nodded solemnly. "And if someone tells me they're absolutely sure, ask them what they're afraid of losing." As he left the chamber, Colin had the distinct, uncomfortable sensation of walking away from the only place in the palace where truth wasn't negotiated. He did not yet know that by the end of the day, that walk would become an exile. But the palace, humming softly around him, already knew. Colin had learned that when the palace summoned you without explanation, it was rarely because someone wanted to thank you for your service. Gratitude in Valeris required paperwork, witnesses, and at least one ceremonial sash. Urgency, on the other hand, traveled light. The council chamber unfolded around him in layered tiers of translucent crystal, each seat subtly elevated to remind its occupant exactly where they stood in the social ecosystem. Colin took his place at the advisory arc, slightly off-center, close enough to be useful and far enough to be expendable. He offered a polite nod to Queen Mereth. She acknowledged it with the faintest inclination of her head, a gesture so restrained it could have been mistaken for a muscle twitch. The air felt different, tighter. Even the ambient hum of the palace system seemed to have lowered its pitch, like a machine bracing itself. "Advisor Colin," Mereth said, "you are aware of the security breach that occurred during the third night cycle." "Yes, Your Majesty," Colin replied, though I was hoping to remain blissfully unaware for at least another hour. No one laughed. That was new. A projection flared to life at the center of the chamber, displaying a rotating lattice of symbols, encryption patterns, access logs, timestamps. To Colin, it looked like a very angry piece of abstract art. The Stargate coordination codes were accessed without authorization, one of the senior ministers said. His ears were long and rigid, his expression permanently carved into something that suggested wisdom without curiosity. "These codes are restricted to a limited advisory circle." Colin nodded. "I assume this is where you reassure everyone that the system is infallible and the breach is therefore impossible." The minister frowned. "The system is infallible." "Ah," Colin said, "then we're doomed." A ripple of discomfort moved through the chamber. Queen Mereth's gaze sharpened, not in anger but in warning. "Advisor," she said, "this is not the moment." "Understood," Colin replied. "I will limit myself to doom silence." The projection zoomed in. A highlighted data trail pulsed softly. "This access signature matches your advisory clearance," another voice said. "Your authorization codes were used." Colin leaned forward slightly. "Then someone has either stolen my credentials or your system thinks I'm more energetic at night than I actually am." The accusation settled slowly, like dust after a controlled explosion. Colin felt it then. Not fear, but recognition. The pattern was familiar. Convenient evidence. No witnesses who could be cross-examined without diplomatic fallout. A problem that needed a solution shaped like a scapegoat. "I request a full audit," Colin said calmly. "Independent verification of the logs, biometric cross-referencing." "The urgency of the situation does not allow for extended procedure," the First Minister interrupted. "Trust in the Council must be preserved." "By skipping the part where we find out what actually happened," Colin said. "A bold strategy." Queen Mereth's fingers tightened almost imperceptibly on the arm of her throne. "Enough," she said. Silence snapped into place. "Advisor Colin," she continued, "your service to this court has been significant. However, perception matters. The appearance of compromise within the advisory circle threatens not only our security, but our alliances." Colin met her eyes. For a moment, the chamber seemed to narrow to just the two of them. "So," he said softly, "this is about appearance." Her voice remained steady. "It is about stability." He smiled, small and tired. "Those words are often cousins." The verdict came quickly after that, wrapped in formal language and ceremonial restraint. Temporary expulsion from the palace pending further review. Restricted access. Immediate departure before the next cycle. Colin bowed when it was over. Deeply, properly. He had learned long ago that dignity, like humor, was one of the few weapons that couldn't be confiscated. "As always," he said, straightening, "it has been an educational experience." No one responded. As he turned to leave, he caught a flicker of movement near the chamber entrance. Princess Senna stood there, half hidden behind an attendant, her long ears angled forward in sharp focus. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second. Colin gave her the smallest possible shrug. She did not smile. That worried him more than the accusation. The escort that followed him through the corridors was polite, efficient, and painfully silent. His belongings were already being packed by autonomous units, their motions precise and indifferent. The palace moved on as it always did, systems adjusting, lights shifting, drones humming past as if nothing of importance were happening. In his temporary quarters, Colin sat on the edge of the bed and let out a slow breath. "Well," he said to the empty room, "this escalated." Outside, the palace shields shimmered faintly. Somewhere above, stars burned with ancient indifference. And somewhere very nearby, a child who took her duties far too seriously was deciding whether the rules of the palace were worth obeying at all. The palace corridors had a way of amplifying silence. Colin noticed it as he walked, escorted once again, this time toward the departure wing. The lights dimmed slightly as he passed, adjusting to authorized movement, as if the building itself were politely pretending not to stare. His travel case floated beside him, guided by a hovering carrier drone that hummed with irritating cheerfulness. Colin briefly considered asking it to crash into something out of spite, then decided it would probably report him. "Is this really necessary?" he asked the two guards flanking him. "I promise not to steal the palace on my way out." Neither replied. Their ears were neutral, expressions professionally blank. Excellent listeners, terrible conversationalists. The departure chamber opened into a vast circular space where personal shuttles docked like insects clinging to glass. Beyond the transparent shield, Valeris glowed in layered rings, spires catching the light of the system's pale sun. It was beautiful in the way only things that didn't care about you could be. Colin stopped walking. "I'd like a moment," he said. One guard hesitated. The other checked a wrist console, then nodded. 2 minutes. Colin faced the viewport. He had always assumed exile would feel dramatic. Thunder, accusations, perhaps a last-minute reversal. Instead, it felt administrative, like being politely removed from a meeting that had decided it no longer needed honesty. "Well done," he muttered to himself. "You finally became a security threat without doing anything interesting." Behind him, the chamber doors slid open. Small footsteps echoed. Colin did not turn. He already knew. "You weren't supposed to see this part," he said. Princess Senna came to stand beside him, hands folded behind her back in what she probably thought was a very adult posture. Her ceremonial sash was missing, her hair slightly disheveled, ears angled forward so sharply they might have cut glass. "I wasn't supposed to see a lot of things," she said. "I see them anyway." He glanced down at her. "That's going to make your life complicated." "It already has." They stood in silence for a moment, watching a shuttle detach and drift away. "So," Colin said lightly, "this is the part where you tell me everything will be fine." She frowned. "You're leaving?" "Yes." "Because they think you did something?" "Yes." "You didn't?" "No." She nodded as if confirming a hypothesis. "Then they are wrong." "An astute observation," he said. "You should join the council." "I would be arrested within an hour." "Optimistic." She turned to him then, eyes bright with something dangerously close to anger. "You didn't argue enough." Colin raised an eyebrow. "I argued just the right amount to avoid being executed." "That's not the same." "No," he agreed gently. "It isn't." She took a breath, steadying herself. When she spoke again, her voice carried the careful precision she used when discussing strategy. "If you leave," she said, "my education will revert to approved doctrine." "That sounds educational." "It means no questions," she continued. "No hypotheticals. No saying, 'What if everyone here is wrong?'" Colin sighed. "I did tell you honesty was expensive." She looked up at him, ears trembling slightly. "You're the only one who answers me." The words landed harder than any accusation in the council chamber. Before Colin could respond, the doors at the far end of the chamber opened again, this time with ceremonial finality. Queen Mereth entered. The air seemed to shift around her, systems adjusting automatically to her presence. Advisors followed at a respectful distance, murmuring stopped mid-sentence, and even the guard straightened. Mereth's gaze moved from Colin to her daughter. "Senna," she said, "you should not be here." "I know," Senna replied. "That's why I came quickly." Colin closed his eyes briefly. Of all the ways this could go wrong, this was already achieving impressive range. Mereth approached, her expression controlled, composed, and very carefully not maternal. "Advisor Colin has been dismissed," she said. "This is not a matter for—" "If he goes," Senna said, her voice clear and steady, "I go too." The words echoed against the curved walls. Several advisors inhaled sharply. One dropped a datapad. Colin opened his eyes. "Senna," he said quietly, "that is absolutely not—" "I have thought about it," she continued, cutting a look at him that suggested this argument had already been lost. "If loyalty only applies downward, then it is not loyalty. If truth is optional, then duty is pretend." Mereth stopped walking. "You are 8, she said carefully. "Yes, and I am not dramatic." Colin coughed. "Debatable." Senna ignored him. "If Advisor Colin is a threat, then so am I. He taught me everything I know about questioning authority. If that is dangerous, then remove us both." The chamber was utterly silent now. Mereth looked at her daughter, not as a ruler, but as something far more unsettling, a person she did not fully know. "This is not exile," Mereth said. "It is temporary removal." Senna tilted her head. "So is childhood." That one hurt. Colin could tell by the way Mereth's ears stiffened, just a fraction. "Senna," Colin said gently, "you do not have to do this." She looked up at him, eyes fierce and unafraid. "Yes, I do." Mereth's voice lowered. "Why?" The question was not rhetorical. Senna took a breath. "Because he listens. Because he disagrees with me without lying. Because everyone else here wants something from me later." She gestured vaguely at the advisors. "He wants me to think." The words settled heavily. Colin shifted his weight, suddenly uncomfortable with the attention. "In my defense," he said, "I also want her to sleep more." No one laughed. He tried again. "And eat vegetables." Still nothing. Mereth closed her eyes. For a long moment, the palace seemed to wait with her. Then she opened them. "This matter," she said slowly, "will be reviewed." Senna did not relax. "Immediately." Mereth's gaze met Colin's. Something unspoken passed between them. Regret, calculation, something dangerously close to guilt. "Yes," Mereth said, "immediately." The advisors stirred, voices rising in confused protest. The guards shifted uncertainly. Systems chimed softly as protocols recalibrated. Colin let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "Well," he murmured, "this is new." Senna allowed herself the smallest smile. Outside the viewport, the stars continued their silent watch, unaware that a child had just forced an empire to pause, and that nothing in Valeris would ever feel quite as orderly again. The palace reacted to crisis the way it always did, by becoming very efficient and very confused at the same time. Protocols activated without waiting for permission. Corridors subtly rerouted foot traffic. Doors sealing and reopening in patterns designed to prevent panic, while quietly encouraging it elsewhere. Somewhere deep in the palace core, an intelligence subroutine labeled unusual political event. Minor upgraded itself to concerning and began asking for updates every 12 seconds. Queen Mereth sat alone in the observation alcove above the council chamber, the one place where no advisors were allowed unless summoned. The transparent wall before her displayed the city of Valeris in slow rotation, its spires catching light, its transit lanes threading through the air like disciplined veins. It looked perfect. That irritated her. Behind her, the door chimed softly. "Enter," she said without turning. Chief Archivist Thalin stepped inside, his long ears folded in a way that suggested both respect and mild terror. He carried a data slate hugged close to his chest, as though it might attempt escape. "You requested an internal review authorization, Your Majesty," he said. "Yes," Mereth replied, "and you look like you're about to argue with me." "Only gently," Thalin said, "and entirely for your own good." She turned then, fixing him with a stare that had ended rebellions. "Proceed," he swallowed. "Reopening the security breach investigation will destabilize the Advisory Council. Several members have already begun preemptive justifications." Mereth raised an eyebrow. "They're confessing?" "No," Thalin said quickly. "They're explaining why, if they were guilty, it would be understandable." Mereth exhaled slowly. "That is never a good sign." She gestured for him to continue. The original data logs, Thalen said, activating the slate, were flagged as complete, but completeness is a setting, not a guarantee. With your authorization, I can bypass the Council's filter protocols. Do it. He hesitated. There will be resistance. Mereth's ears twitched. I am familiar with resistance. As Thalen left, Mereth leaned back in her seat. For the first time since ascending the throne, she allowed herself to consider a thought she had carefully avoided for years, that the palace might be very good at protecting itself from the wrong things. Elsewhere, in a chamber that had once been labeled temporary holding and then quietly renamed provisional quarters for morale reasons, Colin sat cross-legged on the floor, dismantling a maintenance drone. The drone did not belong to him. This had not stopped him. I'm not stealing you, he told it as he carefully removed a casing panel. I'm liberating you from boredom. The drone emitted a confused chirr. Across the room, Princess Senna sat on the bed, watching with intense focus. You're going to get in trouble, she observed. I'm already in trouble, Colin replied. This is a lateral move. He held up a small component. Did you know this model has 3 redundant processors for emotional simulation? Why? Because someone decided machines should feel appreciated. Senna considered that. Do they? This one does not, Colin said. It feels judgmental. The door chimed. Colin froze. If that's a guard, I was meditating. The door opened anyway. Mereth entered. Senna slid off the bed immediately, posture straightening, every inch the princess. Mother. Mereth's gaze flicked to the disassembled drone. Is that palace property? Yes, Colin said, but in my defense, it started it. Senna winced. Mereth closed the door behind her. Advisor Colin, she said, you are not under arrest. That's reassuring, he replied. I had a speech prepared. I'm sure you did. She turned to her daughter. Senna, you frightened half the council. I consider that a public service. Colin coughed, poorly disguising a laugh. Mereth ignored him. You will return to your quarters. Which ones? The ones you were in before all this. Senna blinked. So he's not leaving? Not yet, Mereth said carefully. Colin raised a hand. I feel like I should ask what not yet means in royal time. It means, Mereth said, meeting his eyes, that I am no longer satisfied with convenient answers. She turned back to Senna. Do you know why this palace exists? To govern, Senna said. To protect. And to isolate, Mereth added quietly. From chaos. From doubt. From uncomfortable truths. Senna frowned. Is that good? Mereth hesitated. The pause was answer enough. Colin stood, brushing dust from his hands. For what it's worth, Your Majesty, isolation is very effective. Right up until it isn't. She studied him. You speak as if you've seen this before. I'm human, he said. We specialize in it. A soft chime echoed through the room as Mereth's wrist console activated. Data streamed across its surface. Timestamps, access routes, authorization mismatches. Her expression darkened. That was fast, Colin said. I didn't even finish breaking the drone. You didn't need to, Mereth replied. Someone broke the truth instead. She looked at Senna then, not as a queen, not as a symbol, but as a child sitting on a bed in a room that smelled faintly of machine oil and rebellion. You were right, Mereth said quietly. Senna tilted her head. About what? That this place listens very poorly. Colin shifted his weight. I've been saying that for years, usually louder. Mereth allowed herself a small, tired smile. I know. Outside the chamber, the palace hummed on, systems recalibrating, secrets loosening their grip. Somewhere in the data streams, patterns began to unravel, and those who had relied on silence felt, for the first time, something dangerously unfamiliar. Uncertainty. The investigation did not announce itself. It slipped through the palace like a rumor with excellent credentials. Colin noticed the change first in the way doors hesitated before opening, as if reconsidering their loyalties. Data panels lingered a fraction longer on certain screens. Courtiers smiled too quickly, laughed too loudly, and suddenly remembered urgent appointments elsewhere when he entered a room. For a man who had nearly been exiled, he was receiving an impressive amount of attention from people pretending not to notice him. He and Senna had returned to their usual tutoring chamber, though usual now came with two discrete security nodes and a hovering sensor that claimed to be monitoring air quality while very clearly listening to everything. That one's new, Colin said, pointing at it. It's blinking, Senna replied. That means it's pretending not to record. Ah, amateur mistake. They sat across from one another, a holographic star map suspended between them. Senna tapped a system cluster, expanding it into a web of transit routes and political boundaries. Mother says I can help, she said. Colin raised an eyebrow. Help how? By asking questions people don't like. Excellent, he said. My favorite genre. She zoomed in on the palace sector. Why would someone frame you instead of just removing you? Colin leaned back. Because removal without explanation creates curiosity. Framing creates closure. Everyone prefers a neat story where the problem has a face. And you were convenient. Painfully so. Elsewhere in the palace, convenience was unraveling. Chief Archivist Thalen stood knee-deep in data streams, his long ears drooping as if weighed down by timestamps. The deeper he dug, the clearer the pattern became. And the uglier. Logs that had been sealed too quickly. Authorizations rerouted through legacy access points no one had bothered to deactivate because doing so would require admitting the system wasn't perfect. He muttered to himself as he worked. Of course, it's the legacy ports. It's always the legacy ports. The palace intelligence chimed. Correlation threshold exceeded. Thalen froze. Already? Multiple advisory clearances accessed from non-biometric sources? Thalen's ears snapped upright. That's not possible. Correction, the intelligence replied. That is statistically unlikely. Which is palace speak for someone cheated, Thalen said grimly. Back in the tutoring chamber, Senna frowned at a set of overlapping data trails Colin had sketched for her. These don't align, she said. If you access the codes, your movement pattern would show coffee breaks, mild procrastination, and at least one existential crisis, Colin finished. Yes. So the logs were altered? Yes. By someone who knew how they're usually read. Colin smiled. Now you're thinking like a conspirator. I don't want to be one, she said. Good. They're terrible company. The chamber door chimed, then opened without waiting for permission. Queen Mereth entered, her expression composed, but her eyes sharp with a focus Colin had only seen during wartime briefings. They're unraveling, she said without preamble. That sounds promising, Colin replied, or deeply alarming. Both, Mereth said. Thalen has identified 3 advisory members whose access patterns contradict their testimonies. Senna leaned forward. Which ones? Mereth hesitated. People you have known since infancy. Senna's ears drooped. That's worse. Yes, Mereth said quietly. It is. She turned to Colin. You were framed because you are external, trusted by me, and invisible to most of the council's emotional calculus. Invisible? Colin said. I worked very hard on my sarcasm. They underestimated its impact, Mereth said. As did I. A soft alert chimed on her wrist console. She glanced at it, then sighed. They are requesting a closed hearing, she said, to explain themselves. Colin winced. Never attend a meeting where the phrase, to explain ourselves, is used. I intend to, Mereth replied. Publicly. That got his attention. You're sure? No, she said, but certainty has been overvalued. The hearing took place in the council chamber, now packed with observers, analysts, and one extremely confused pastry vendor who had wandered in during the seating chaos and been too afraid to leave. Colin stood off to the side, officially reinstated as temporarily relevant. Senna sat beside her mother, legs dangling, posture impeccable. The accused advisors spoke smoothly, too smoothly. Their explanations overlapped, supporting one another in ways that suggested rehearsal rather than truth. They spoke of system errors, unfortunate coincidences, and the regrettable necessity of swift action. Senna raised her hand. Several advisors flinched. Yes, Princess, one said, forcing a smile. If the system is infallible, Senna asked, why did you override its request for biometric confirmation? Silence. One advisor cleared his throat. Efficiency. Senna nodded. Efficiency is what people choose when they don't want witnesses. A murmur rippled through the chamber. Colin bit his lip to keep from smiling. Thalen stepped forward then, projecting a cascade of data that painted a very different picture. Altered logs, shared access nodes, a chain of decisions that led not to accident but intent. The advisors began to sweat. Mereth rose slowly from her seat. "This court," she said, "will no longer confuse stability with silence." The verdict followed swiftly. Removals, sanctions, reassignments to distant research outposts where ambition went to die quietly among equations. When it was over, the chamber felt lighter, as if something toxic had finally been vented into space. Senna leaned toward Colin. "Is it over?" He considered that. "The part where they thought they could get away with it?" "Yes." She smiled, small but satisfied. Mereth watched them both, a complicated mix of relief and regret settling into her expression. The palace hummed on, but its rhythm had changed, and for the first time in a long while, truth moved through its halls without asking permission. The palace spent the morning pretending nothing had changed, which was impressive considering how many people were suddenly no longer employed there. Colin noticed it when the transit corridors recalibrated their traffic flows, compensating for the absence of several senior advisors by politely rerouting junior officials who had not yet realized their career paths had just been shortened. The palace intelligence announced these changes in a calm, reassuring tone, as if this were a routine furniture rearrangement and not the political equivalent of removing load-bearing walls. Colin walked beside Senna through the upper galleries, where observation windows curved outward into open space. Stars drifted past in slow parallax, distant suns smearing light across the glass like paint dragged by an unseen hand. "They're avoiding us," Senna said. "They're recalibrating their survival instincts," Colin replied. "Very similar process. Less dignity." She glanced behind them. A cluster of aides abruptly turned a corner that very clearly did not lead where they needed to go. "Do they think I'll ask questions?" she asked. "Yes," Colin said. "And worse, that you'll remember the answers." They reached a quiet alcove where the palace's external sensor array could be seen adjusting its orientation, tracking micro-debris and the faint gravitational ripple of a passing freighter. Senna leaned against the railing, ears relaxed for once. "My mother hasn't slept," she said. Colin didn't joke this time. "Neither have you," she shrugged. "I was thinking. That's usually the cause." She hesitated. "Did I do the right thing?" He took a moment before answering. "You did a necessary thing. Right and wrong tend to show up later, once everyone's had time to be uncomfortable." She considered that. Adults dislike discomfort. Adults dislike being wrong even more. Behind them, footsteps approached, measured, unhurried. Queen Mereth joined them, her presence altering the space in subtle ways. Sensors dimmed, ambient noise softened, systems acknowledging authority without fanfare. "You're conspiring," Mereth said. Colin smiled, discussing the philosophical implications of destabilizing a government. Senna nodded solemnly. "And snacks?" Mereth exhaled, a sound that might have been laughter if she'd practiced more recently. "Advisor Colin," she said, "walk with me." They moved along the gallery, Senna following just behind, listening intently while pretending to admire the stars. "You have been formally cleared," Mereth said. "Your position is restored." Colin inclined his head. "Thank you." "That is not all," she continued. "The advisory council will be restructured, transparency protocols expanded, external audits mandated. That will make you very popular." "Yes," Mereth said dryly. "I expect to be adored." She stopped walking and turned to him. "You were almost removed not because you failed, but because you succeeded without permission." Colin raised an eyebrow. "I'll try to be more considerate next time." "I don't want you to be," she said. That surprised him. "You taught my daughter to think," Mereth continued. "Not to obey, not to charm, not to maneuver. To think. And you did it without trying to shape her into anything useful to you." Senna beamed at that, ears lifting. Mereth's voice softened. "That was my failure. I allowed this palace to turn childhood into preparation." Colin shifted, uncomfortable with sincerity. "In my defense, she was already terrifyingly intelligent." "I know," Mereth said. "That's what frightened me." They stood in silence for a moment, the stars sliding past. ancient and indifferent witnesses to a very recent mess. I am changing her education, Mereth said. She will still learn governance, strategy, law, but she will also be allowed to be wrong, to be curious, to be eight. Senna looked up sharply. Does that mean I can ask why the gravity regulators hum differently at night? Mereth sighed. Yes. And take things apart? Yes. And, within reason, Colin grinned. Careful, Your Majesty. That's how rebellions start. Mereth glanced at him. I know. Later that cycle, the palace held what it called a restorative session and what everyone else called a reckoning. Those who remained in power spoke more carefully. Those who had once dominated conversation now listened, visibly struggling with the unfamiliar sensation. Colin took his place beside Mereth, officially reinstated, unofficially watched very closely. Senna sat between them, feet swinging, attention sharp. An advisor began a presentation filled with projections, probabilities, and carefully neutral language. Senna raised her hand. Yes, Princess? The advisor said, voice tight. If your plan fail, she asked, who is blamed? The advisor opened his mouth, closed it, and tried again. We will reassess. That's not an answer. Colin leaned over. It's an evasion with good posture. Mereth hid a smile. The advisor swallowed. Responsibility would be shared. Senna nodded. So no one. Silence spread. Mereth cleared her throat. Answer the question. The advisor's ears drooped. I would be responsible. Senna smiled. Then proceed. Colin exhaled slowly. I'm very proud right now. The palace intelligence chimed softly, logging the exchange under notable governance event. As the session ended, Mereth lingered behind, watching advisors disperse with newfound caution. You may regret this, Colin said quietly. I already do, Mereth replied. But I regret not doing it more. She looked at him. Stay. He blinked. That sounded less like a request. It wasn't. Senna grabbed his hand before he could respond. You're staying. He glanced at her, then at Mereth, then at the vast, complicated palace that had nearly expelled him and now felt altered. Yes, he said finally, I'm staying. Outside, the palace shields adjusted to a minor solar fluctuation, compensating effortlessly. Systems adapted, structures held. Inside, something far less mechanical did the same, and for the first time since Valeris had crowned its queen, the future felt uncertain in a way that suggested growth rather than collapse. The palace settled into its new rhythm slowly, like a machine recalibrating after discovering one of its assumptions had been wrong for a very long time. Systems updated, protocols rewrote themselves, and people learned, sometimes painfully, that silence was no longer a substitute for loyalty. Colin noticed the difference in small things. Doors no longer opened automatically for certain advisors who had once expected them to. Meetings ran longer, not because of speeches, but because questions were no longer treated as interruptions. Even the palace intelligence adjusted its tone, replacing absolute statements with probabilities. It sounded, Colin thought, vaguely humbled. He stood once more in the tutoring chamber, which had been officially renamed something elaborate and ceremonial, and was immediately ignored by everyone who mattered. The walls still displayed star maps, though now Senna insisted on rearranging them to reflect alternative trade routes and hypothetical disasters, just to see what would happen. This one collapses, she said, tapping a projection, but only if everyone panics. Colin leaned over her shoulder. That's true of most civilizations. She grinned. Her long ears twitched with satisfaction. Mother says I'm not allowed to destabilize anything before midday. Very reasonable of her. Queen Mereth watched them from the doorway, arms folded, expression unreadable in the way only long practice could achieve. She had changed too, though fewer people noticed. She listened longer. She spoke less. When she did speak, it was with the unsettling precision of someone who had accepted that authority was not diminished by doubt. You're teaching her again, Mereth said. Colin turned. She keeps insisting. Senna nodded firmly. I would like to continue being inconvenient. Mereth sighed. I suppose that can be arranged. They moved together toward the observation gallery, where the city of Valeris spread beneath them in all its impossible geometry. Ships drifted in ordered lanes, energy shields shimmered faintly, and beyond it all, space waited with its usual indifference. The Council has approved the final reforms, Mereth said. External oversight, rotational authority, no permanent advisory seats. Colin whistled softly. You're going to be very unpopular for decades. Yes, Mereth replied. I find that comforting. She looked at him then. You could have left. I considered it, Colin said. Briefly. Then I remembered humans are terrible at leaving things unfinished. And now? Now, he said, watching Senna peer through the glass as if trying to intimidate the stars. I think I'm exactly where I should be. Mereth nodded once. So do I. Later, the palace held a ceremony, not a grand one. Mereth had insisted on restraint, but one unavoidable in its symbolism. Colin was formally reinstated, his role expanded, his authority clarified in language that left very little room for creative interpretation. The audience applauded politely, then more sincerely when Senna applauded enthusiastically and accidentally activated a projection of celebratory fireworks that were not scheduled for another month. Oops, she said. Colin leaned down. You just made a point about preparedness. She smiled. I meant to. When it was over, when the crowd dispersed and the palace returned to its endless, thoughtful hum, Colin found himself alone on the balcony where everything had begun. The courier drones still drifted between spires. The gravity regulators still adjusted by fractions no one noticed unless they were looking. He thought about who he had been when he first arrived. Careful, observant, content to survive by wit alone. He thought about the man he had almost become. Quiet, removed, safely absent. Instead, he had stayed. He had spoken. He had mattered. Footsteps approached. You're brooding, Senna said. I'm reflecting, he replied. Brooding is louder. She joined him at the railing. Will you ever leave? He considered the question honestly. Someday. Everyone does, she nodded. But not yet. No, he said. Not yet. She looked up at him, serious. When I am queen, I will remember this. He raised an eyebrow. That's either reassuring or deeply concerning. Both, she said, clearly pleased. Above them, a distant star flared briefly as a solar event rippled harmlessly across the palace shields. The palace adjusted. Life went on. Colin smiled. The galaxy remained vast, unpredictable, and full of people very certain they were right. But somewhere within it, a child was learning how to question, a queen was learning how to listen, and a man who had once been expendable had discovered that influence, when wielded without ambition, could change the shape of a future. And for once, that was enough.